It is still true at the present day that many individuals have to undergo private, stylized versions of that break with theistic, and more specifically with Christian beliefs, which was so marked a feature of Victorian culture. Because this is true of culture heroes of our time as various as Russell and Sartre, we may be apt to underrate the difference between the central part played by the experience of that break in the culture of the 19th century and the peripheral part that it plays in our culture today. I want to make this a major theme of these lectures by suggesting that the debate between theists and atheists has been insufficiently self-conscious for the most part, and that what is primarily important is not to try and make fresh moves in the debate so much as to reconsider just how important it after all is. Do people find the echo from this quite intolerable? It's all right. Mrs. Humphrey Ward's best-selling novel of 1888, Robert Elsmere, although it describes a transition from Orthodox Christianity not to what we might think of as pure atheism, but to a set of undogmatic religious attitudes, is nevertheless a perceptive portrait of what those who made the more radical break characteristically underwent. For even a more obviously radical atheist, such as Feuerbach was 40 years earlier, was concerned not only to refute the formulations, but also to maintain the essence of the Christian religion once it had been detached from those supernatural formulations. And the philosophy of T.H. Green, which is what Robert Elsmere acquired in place of Christianity, is only theistic in a Pickwickian sense. The inclusion of Green, both as a character and of his philosophy in the novel, is itself important. For Robert Elsmere, in losing his faith, as he's made to by his author, is made also to encounter the central intellectual issues of his day. And this, above all, distinguishes the 19th century debate from the 20th, and also from earlier debates. David Hume could question theism on grounds that, original in detail as they are of a type which had been available for millennia. Even Newman, in replying to him, could retort with arguments which, although they are original, are of a kind which could, without anachronism, have been used at other times. But most of those whose belief was put in question in the mid-19th century had to cope with issues at the very core of their specifically contemporary culture. Darwinian biology, the philosophical themes derived from Hegel, both by continental Feuerbachians and by Englishmen such as Green and Bradley, and perhaps above all the techniques of modern historical criticism, which both partly grew out of and partly found their most radical application in the quest for the historical Jesus. Robert Elsmere, for example, in Mrs. Ward's novel, found himself inquiring why the assumptions of the new medieval history were not carried over to the New Testament. If, so Robert Elsmere is made to argue by his creator, the medieval historian finds in the medieval records that some defeat of a barbarian invasion is explained by a miraculous intervention, he does not entertain for a moment the possibility that this explanation is correct. But if this is so, why should the New Testament records be treated in any different way? This manner in which the theistic issue lay directly athwart the immediately advancing applications of intellectual method is not reproduced today. Cybernetics, the physics of fundamental particles, sociological theory, don't seem to raise with the same immediacy questions about religion. The tension of the choice between the beliefs of theism and the truths embedded in contemporary culture, which was so real for Sidgwick or for Arnold, leaves no mark on intellectuals now. Now, at once it may be said that this comment reflects perhaps upon contemporary culture, but not upon the issue that divides theism from atheism. That issue, so the theist in particular will claim, remains and must remain the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that it certainly must so remain in the theist's perspective tells us something important about that perspective. But in order to engage with this claim of the theist, I must ask whether the change in the nature of the debate over theism and atheism may not be connected with, indeed explained by, more fundamental changes in our culture. One way of signalling our perspective on cultural history is our adoption of this rather than that calendar. BC AD, the year of the Hejira, the year 1 of the French Revolution. The calendar of secularized man perhaps ought to run in 2 periods, one from the New Stone Age to the 19th century, the second thereafter. What break does this division signal? The origin of the first period, like that of so many others, is a matter of speculation, in this case the speculations of Levi-Strauss. Levi-Strauss has argued that the technological revolution of the Neolithic age must have been the outcome of a long and brilliant study of nature. Neolithic man's medicines, his foods, his metalworking, all presuppose a system of classification and theory by which nature was understood and subdued. And Levi-Strauss therefore argues that the reply to Levi-Brühl, with his characterization of the primitive mind as pre-logical and irrational, should not merely be the weaker and commoner assertion that within his own terms the primitive is as rational as we are, even though his system of thought differs profoundly from that of modern science, but the stronger claim that the primitive is as scientific as we are. So Levi-Strauss writes, there are 2 distinct modes of scientific thought. These are certainly not a function of different stages of development of the human mind, but rather of 2 strategic levels at which nature is accessible to scientific inquiry. One roughly adapted to that of perception and the imagination, the other at a remove from it. It is as if the necessary connections which are the object of all science, Neolithic or modern, could be arrived at by 2 different routes, one very close to, and the other more remote from, direct sense experience. That Levi-Strauss's marvelous ingenuity in mapping the logical patterns of primitive systems of classification is indeed the discovery of a whole mode of grasping and understanding nature, I have no wish to deny. But that this mode can be properly called science, in the same sense in which modern physics is so called, seems to betray a misunderstanding at once of science and of the sharp contrast between scientific modes of thought and those modes characterized by Levi-Strauss. We can begin to understand why this is so if we consider a second thesis advanced by Levi-Strauss in La Pensée Sauvage, namely that men's conception of the relations between nature and culture is a function of the modification of their own social relations, a thesis which leads Levi-Strauss to see the closest of logical and symbolic relationships between the concepts and categories with which primitive man understands his own society and those with which he understands nature. But this thesis at once creates problems for the characterization of primitive thought as scientific. For the relative unalterability of primitive social structure suggests that the conceptual schemes of primitive man will have a characteristic inflexibility, whereas it is precisely the mark of modern science that although its modes of activity and its institutional bases may owe much to the form of the society in which they arose, the content of that science becomes autonomous in its capacity for change that is independent of social change or social stability. Attempts to deny this by asserting, for example, that the Darwinian theory of natural selection mirrors the competitive struggle of Victorian capitalism, or that 17th century mechanics reflects preconceptions of the rising bourgeoisie, are at the very best an attempt to draw our attention to certain coincidental analogies, and even then an attempt which misses the point that the essence of science consists not in the theories advanced at any one time, but in the capacity to transform and replace those theories. Levi-Strauss, of course, in seeing a connection between the way we view society, the way men view society, and the way they view nature, is not involved in any crudity of this kind. He goes out of his way to assert that all our understanding of both nature and society is mediated by conceptual schemes, and it is the conceptual scheme which dominates our thinking, which determines what we find meaningful and what we find problematic. Since the conceptual scheme is prior to our understanding of society as well as nature, it cannot be a function of it. Nonetheless, the sophistication of a Levi-Strauss, as much as the crudity of an Engels, entails a willingness to characterize as science an activity of theorizing which does not depend, for the nature of its developments, on a continuous attempt at the falsification of its own previously held theories. It is in fact, as Dr. Mary Douglas has shown in her book Purity and Danger, a mark of primitive thought that it finds it difficult to tolerate whatever is anomalous or exceptional relative to its own established classificatory schemes. Mrs. Douglas's investigations were aimed at producing an explanation of taboo rules and more generally of ritual and other rules about pollution and uncleanness. Her thesis is that we misconstrue these rules if we look for underlying hygienic purposes, or indeed if we construe the rules as having any sort of utilitarian justification. When we do construe primitive rules in this way, we are projecting onto the primitive mind beliefs in pathogenic organisms which are alien to it. The concept of dirt, of uncleanness which is applicable, is that of matter out of place, of disorder. The unclean is what violates our notion of order, and the rules for dealing with pollution are techniques for preventing it harming us, which enable us at once to recognize its existence and to resist any revision of our beliefs and of our conceptual scheme in the face of it. If we set Mrs. Douglas's account of the primitive mind beside Karl Popper's account of science, we at once see that the one is, as it were, the photographic negative of the other. Where the primitive acknowledges the existence of the anomalous, of the exceptional, of that which constitutes a counterexample to the generalizations which it affirms, only in order to mask that existence by outlawing it, and so avoiding any revision or reformulation of the relevant beliefs, the scientist is involved in a continuous attempt to search out what is anomalous and exceptional, and therefore provides a reason for either abandoning or revising the theory that he has hitherto accepted. What I've been doing up to this point is drawing an intentionally sharp line between two modes of thought, and I now want to situate theism in relation to them. We can understand the logical situation of theism best if we see that in entering the modern world, it had to face two successive crises. These crises occur for different social and cultural groups at different times, but the first crisis is most commonly experienced in the 17th or 18th centuries, the second in the 19th or 20th. Moreover, these crises, although they have an indirect impact upon the life of ordinary believers, are primarily, both chronologically and logically, crises for the theologically sophisticated. The first crisis has the following form. Theism was, after all, elaborated in the light of pre-scientific cultures where the anomalous and the exceptional are not permitted to falsify existing beliefs. Theism, indeed, marks a development of this mode of thought to a point at which irrefutability has been written into the content of the belief in God itself, and is not just a characterization of the manner in which the belief is professed and acted upon. The point is not, decisively not, that theistic beliefs are unfalsifiable in the sense in which some positivistic philosophers have argued. Traditional theistic belief has factual content, precisely because some episodes in the past, the history of Moses or Abraham, for example, some general features of the universe, the existence of life, for example, and some future states in an afterlife, are held to be such that, had God not existed, things would not be and have been as they are. But all this is held together with the view that no set of phenomena, actual or possible, could occur now, where now is whatever point in history we are at, such that their occurrence would show that God does not exist or lacks the fundamental attributes ascribed to him. While not therefore unfalsifiable in the positivistic sense, theism is irrefutable in the Popperian sense, and the rise of science couldn't but create a crisis for it, the first crisis to which I've referred. For when the issue of refutability, the question of what would falsify a given set of beliefs, is first raised for theism, the theist faces two alternatives. He may allow that his theism is a factual belief in a perfectly ordinary sense, and exhibit the evidence the non-occurrence of which would leave it without justification. In so doing, he agrees to assign to his belief the status of an hypothesis. It acquires and maintains factual content at the cost of becoming vulnerable in just the way that any hypothesis is. If the hypothesis is that of Newton's scholium, where God is required as the first cause, who introduces motion into a system of bodies, every other aspect of which, including their relative motions, is explained in non-theological terms, then that hypothesis will be vulnerable to a Laplace who has no need of it. or to a James Mill, who inquires why, if we require God as a cause external to the physical universe to account for its existence or character, we do not require a further cause to account for the existence and character of God. That is to say, theism can acclimatize itself in a culture where refutability is taken seriously by accepting its reformulation as a version of deism. But it can also, of course, refuse to acclimatize itself, and in so doing it will have to draw the sharpest of lines between itself and secular intellectual disciplines. Theology then becomes a discipline which legislates for itself, which disowns the current badges of intellectual legitimation, and as a realm apart, its links with general culture necessarily become more remote. What I have called the first crisis in the modern history of theism amounts then to a debate over the issue as to whether theism shall adopt the strategy of converting itself into deism, or that of separating itself from general intellectual culture. It is perhaps a key feature of this crisis that it is rarely made fully explicit at the time in any one author taken by himself. For the terms in which I have had to characterize it are available to us because we are spectators looking back after the event. But we find a partial consciousness of this dilemma in many 17th century writers, and what is most nearly a full consciousness of it in Pascal. Pascal resists the parcelling out of God into separate functions, the disclosure of which are required if nature and society are to be what they are, and the formulation of which would yield deistic hypotheses, and so writes, "The God of the Christians is not simply the God who is the author of geometrical truths or of the order of the elements. This is the view of pagans and Epicureans." And elsewhere in the same fragment, he identifies their attitude explicitly with the deistic belief in a God who is an omnipotent cause. They imagine, he writes, that the Christian religion consists solely of worshipping a God who is looked upon as great, powerful, and eternal. And this is in fact deism, which is almost as far removed from Christianity as atheism is, its complete opposite. It's precisely because he will not allow the deistic alternative that Pascal finds himself confronting the atheist in the name of a theism which is in no way refutable and therefore in no way confirmable either. It is, I suspect, in Pascal's Pensée that atheism is treated as a serious option for the first time in theistic history. Of course, there were atheistic precursors in the ancient world, but theism was left unscathed by them. And the fool whom the psalmist envisaged in his saying that there was no God was not, when he spoke Hebrew, denying that God existed, but merely supposing that God was absent. St. Anselm's mistranslation of the Hebrew fool into a medieval Latin atheistic fool is still only speculative. Atheism is a logical possibility for Anselm, which theism is required to consider, but scarcely a live moral option which the theist has to fear as a serious rival. But Pascal, in the dialogue of fragment 233, confronts an interlocutor who not only does not believe, but who is, Pascal says, so constituted that he cannot believe. And Pascal, unlike Aquinas or John Locke, is able to find no arguments from the character of the universe to address to this man. All he can confront him with is a choice, the choice elaborated in his doctrine of the wager. This notion that theistic belief is something to be chosen is quite new in the history of theism. Pascal's innovation makes him the ancestor of both Kierkegaard and Karl Barth, but he has no predecessors. Of course, notions of choice are common enough in theological writers, but it is always a choice of allegiance or obedience or disobedience in the light of given beliefs that is involved. The explicitness of the apparently paradoxical notion of choosing to believe at all is what is new. Theism is thus, as a consequence of the first crisis, reformulated in alternative versions, the one deistic, the other, to use an expression not available to its founding fathers, existentialist. Now, the second crisis presupposes the first. What happened in the 19th century is unintelligible until we know what happened in the 17th. The second crisis occurs when theism, in either of its new formulations, is brought before the bar of the critical standards of a culture in which at every point in history, in science, and in ordinary life, the attitude of mind which treats refutability as a necessary character of warrantable belief has become established. and this is the classical crisis of belief in the 19th and 20th centuries. We may note three well-defined styles of response in that crisis. There is first the response of those who encounter the deistic version of theism and reject it on the kind of grounds on which James Mill rejected it. It was his reading of James Mill which discredited religious belief for the young Bertrand Russell. It was recognizing the contingency of the world, its certness, its inexplicability in terms of any Leibnizian sufficient reason why things as a whole should be as they are and not otherwise, that involved Sartre in atheism. Of atheists of this kind, we can characteristically ask and answer the question, in which God is it that they disbelieve? In Russell's case, the answer is that it is the God of Newton's scholium. In Sartre's case, it's the God of Leibniz's theodicy. My point about the two crises of theism can in fact be made succinctly in part by remarking that the gods in whom the 19th and early 20th century came to disbelieve were only invented in the 17th century. We ought also to notice that in being able to ask and answer the question, in which God is it that they disbelieve, of this type of atheist, we discriminate them from a quite different type with whom we are much more familiar today. The secularist and self-styled free-thinking societies of the 19th century, whose backbone was often the self-educated working-class intellectual, used to lament that they recruited almost entirely from the ranks of the churches, and not at all from the masses of non-believers who surrounded them. The self-conscious ex-Christian atheist is thus to be distinguished from the secularized unbeliever who sees no point in actively denying the existence of God because he has never seen any point in affirming it in the first place. The first type of atheist continues to ask, and to ask systematically, the questions to which traditional theism gave answers, although he gives his own answer. The second type no longer asks those questions, and to that extent his culture is impoverished. The relation between the first and second type is sometimes, but by no means always, that of father and son. That is, the children of active free thinkers very often lapse from an active into a merely passive atheism, and this too is a continuous complaint among the Victorian secularists. But the ranks of passive atheism are recruited over a much wider area, and to this point I shall have to revert later in the argument. The second well-defined form of response is that of those who reject the deistic attempt to come to terms with the climate of secular thought and try to preserve a theistic enclave in both thought and life. Intellectually, this response takes the form of insisting on the idiosyncrasy of religious concepts and beliefs. Culturally, it takes the obvious form of insisting on what theistic religions have in common rather than on what divides them. And this response is embodied not only in the ecumenical movement, but in its extensions into the continuous blurring of differences between, say, Judaism and Christianity, and between both of these and other theisms, which is so characteristic of contemporary religion. The concept of the heathen is something of an embarrassment to the modern theologian, and it must be some time since even a pope would have thought the most important thing he could say as the father of all Christians to visiting Hindus and Buddhists was that if they rejected the gospel of Jesus Christ, they were in almost certain danger of going to hell. Yet if Orthodox Christianity is correct, they are. That is to say, the utmost intellectual insistence on retaining the traditional creedal formulations can be accompanied by a process of natural selection from dogmas in which only some dogmas survive to be attended to, rather than paid the entirely inconsequential deference of not actually being expunged from the articles of faith. The third form of response is to attempt to retain Christian orthodoxy, and also to retain a living relationship between it and the culture of the world outside the Church, and yet to avoid the embarrassments of the clashes and conflicts between orthodox theism and contemporary secular culture. How can this be achieved? Precisely by renouncing and denouncing contemporary secular culture as a false culture. T.S. Eliot's social and political writings are key texts here, although they are a late addition to a tradition which runs from the Tractarians and even from Walter Scott. And the response to Eliot ought to lead us to acknowledge that the picture I have given of modern secular culture so far, inevitably brief and attenuated as it has been, must have suggested a unity and a homogeneity which that culture doesn't possess. The self-conscious cultural atavism of an Eliot is not just a plea for a lost past, but in part a plea for those elements of the past still embodied in the present, for an identity that we can neither now recover nor yet quite disown. If we look at not a largely church-going, albeit secularized society, such as the United States still is, but one where secularization has emptied the churches, such as England or the rest of Western Europe, we will be struck by the difference between the small proportion of the population who profess orthodox Christian beliefs and practice their religion regularly on the one hand, and the very much larger proportion who still make use of the church for the great occasions of the life cycle, birth, marriage, death. This is only one outstanding symptom of the way in which the secularization of the intellectual content of modern culture has not found anything like a total embodiment in its moral and social content. Both the self-conscious intellectual atheist and the mass of passive non-believers, for example, believe that the death of a man's body is the end of that man. But this belief is not embodied in any adequate or even in any inadequate way of reacting to the deaths of our family and our friends, except that way which in both its private and public forms consists in elaborate strategies for avoiding any acknowledgement of the fact that a death has actually occurred. We are either dumb or self-indulgent in our euphemisms, or we half pretend to be half-believers. The argument now needs to be summarized in order to be clarified. I have argued that theism underwent two successive crises in modern cultural history, a first in which it adjusted and adapted to the thought forms of modern culture, a second in which, having so adapted itself, it encountered that culture in such a way as to provoke responses either of unbelief or of deformed and truncated belief. But if I am to use this historical interpretation as a basis from which other argument may proceed, I must now develop what I have already said in a number of ways. The relevance of the debate about God to the Victorian age consisted in its lying at a focal point for both culture and morality. The epistemological standards and habits built up in both history and science confronted a theism which was still so intimately connected with the moral life that the question of whether theism was true and the question of the forms of the moral life could not be divorced from one another. In saying this, I must distinguish what I am asserting from the contentions of those Christian theologians who have argued that the abandonment of theistic belief would inevitably lead to moral decline. That is one possible answer to the question about the relationship of theism to morality, and it's an answer which I shall examine in the second lecture. But it's the inevitability of asking the question about the relationship of Christianity to morals, rather than that of giving any particular answer to it, which marked the mid-Victorian age. What is more, the question confronted the questioner with a choice which still had some of the dimensions of a religious choice. Now, in saying this, I want to underline the continuity of the dispute over theism in the Victorian age with earlier episodes in the history of theism. Tillich used to emphasize how secularization is not merely a process external to theism, the values of which are opposed to the values of theism, but that a drive towards secularization is itself entailed by the content of theism. For it is of the essence of theism that it insists upon resisting any confusion between God and any feature of the world. Even Christ's human nature is to be distinguished from his divine nature according to Christian orthodoxy. The worship of Jesus the man, as distinct from reverence before him, which is so characteristic of modern Christianity, is heresy from that standpoint. But theism is not only to be distinguished from post-Christian transformations, it is sharply distinguished from all pre-theistic beliefs in which sacredness adheres in features of nature and society. The gods of the heathen are partially visible, the God of Abraham is wholly invisible. This ability to hand over successive areas of human life to secular standards is up to a certain point of assistance to theism in preventing conflict. It allows withdrawal from claims that cannot be upheld in the secular sphere. But it may and did reach a point at which physics and politics, using both terms in their broadest senses, define a world in which theism has no role at all. An emphasis upon this aspect of the history of theism may help to rescue me from a charge of crude oversimplification in one respect. for it may be thought that the scheme I have proposed for understanding the history of theism is one which totally fails to notice the point that theism encountered intellectual unbelief long before it encountered the intellectual temper of modern science and history. But the earlier unbelief which theism encountered, especially the unbelief of the ancient world, it encountered first as something external to its own culture, and secondly as embodying intellectual methods, the methods of ancient skepticism, for example, to which there was a viable form of reply. Whereas the tendency towards unbelief, which posed the dilemma for a Sidgwick or an Arnold or a Leslie Stephen, was part of the substance of a culture which he could not disown without disowning himself. But to say that is to bring out both the role of theism as conflict-creating in 19th century life and its loss of that role now. The key reason why contemporary theism is not a live issue is that its apologetic intentions have been over-successful. The decrease in tension between Christianity and specific theses of secular disciplines is often treated by theologians as a sign of a more favorable climate to Christianity. They ought perhaps to ask whether, in fact, theism has not thereby lost a cultural role which lent to it importance and relevance, whether in being put itself in question in the disputes over evolution and historical criticism of the New Testament, theism did not for the last time present itself as having possible claims to be able to sit in judgment on secular culture. And can theism survive the renunciation of all such claims? I can put all this in another way. Durkheim's view that in worshipping its gods a society is worshipping itself in a disguised form has proved immensely fertile in the study of relatively primitive societies by anthropologists, but far less susceptible of easy application to the relatively advanced societies of the great theistic religions. The reason for this I believe to be that the resistance of theism to the identification of the divine with forms of social life, which I've already mentioned. Theism, when it rises and flourishes, breaks the bonds which join the sacred and the secular. It is of its nature that it cannot retain its own character and be wholly assimilated to the culture of any particular group. Were it to be so assimilated, it would cease to be even partially an external adversary and come instead to be merely an embodiment of the forms and values of whatever culture and society it happened to be situated in. In the past, of course, it has often been partly assimilated, but it's only since the crisis of belief in the last century that theism has so emptied itself of the content that could affront us culturally that it has proved wholly assimilable, and has therefore reverted to the condition of those more primitive pre-theistic forms of religion which Durkheim's thesis applies. And this fact perhaps explains why secularization may take either the Western European form of having nothing to do with religion anymore, or the American form of feeling no need to relinquish it, because to retain it costs so little. When religion is thus able to retain its hold, religious belief itself becomes not so much belief in God as belief in belief. This is sometimes thought in Europe to be a peculiarly American phenomenon, articulated most strikingly in President Eisenhower's assertion that everybody should have a religious faith, and I don't care what it is. But I strongly suspect that, different as the religious situation is in Western Europe, and particularly in England, among those who do believe, the same belief in belief flourishes. All that is different is that the gap in England between what is said and what is meant is rather larger than it is here, and the English habit of oblique self-revelation at once is less apt to produce the evidence of damaging quotations and more liable to invite the charge of hypocrisy. Belief in religious belief as a substitute for belief in God is encouraged from a number of independent sources. One is psychoanalysis. Few psychoanalytic writers have gone as far as Jung in reinterpreting theism in this direction, but some Freudians have been found to participate in the enterprise, and more generally, as Philip Rieff has pointed out, psychotherapy has too often been an agency which substituted the question, will it be useful to believe this, for the question, is this belief true? In so doing, of course, betraying Freud in the most radical way. Again, the political habit in Western nations of preserving religious formulas for use on public ceremonial occasions by men of all beliefs and none, detaches the meaning of what is said from any intention that those who utter these ceremonial formulas might have, and thus allows these formulas to float freely in their meaning, increasing the tendency for religious sentences to be used for purposes other than those of making the theological statements to which they were at one time devoted. What all these tendencies add up to is the fact that contemporary theism, while retaining older forms, has very often changed the content which it invites us to believe or disbelieve. And not only this, but contemporary theism has even altered the concept of what it is to believe or disbelieve. I can best exhibit this change by considering two anomalous locutions which I have had to use in characterizing recent theistic attitudes. I spoke earlier of a type of theologian who urges upon us a choice between belief and unbelief, and I spoke just now of the notion of it being useful to believe certain things. Both of these locutions are anomalous relative to the standard rules governing the use of believe and cognate words in English. Suppose that you ask me whether I believe that it is or it is not going to rain tomorrow, and I reply that I do not know. Suppose that you then urge upon me that I should choose to believe that it's going to rain tomorrow. My inability to do this will not be the outcome of the fact that I simply couldn't summon up sufficient effort, that I tried and tried, but that the belief just would not come. It is that anything that can be summoned up by an act of will simply will not count as a belief, although perhaps as a hope or a wish. This truth about the concept of belief might of course be challenged by citing Pascal's advice to the effect that if we only behave as if we believe, in time we shall come to believe. Surely it may be said, choosing to behave in this way, which we certainly can do, can be described as choosing to believe. But this surely is a mistake. Before I carry out any process of autosuggestion, I do not choose to believe, I simply wish to believe, but also choose to do certain things. After the process is successful, I simply do believe. There is no moment of choice of belief, as distinct from the choice of performing certain actions, as there appears to be in modern theologies influenced by existentialism. And there could not be, if what we are asked to believe is what Pascal asks us to believe in, the truths of Christian orthodoxy. For these truths are, or at least were, intended to be taken as factual in the same sense in which it is a matter of fact whether it will rain tomorrow or not. But if belief of a factual kind cannot be chosen, it follows logically that belief that can be chosen cannot be factual belief. And if modern Christian theology treats Christian belief as belief that can be chosen, it follows that it treats it as belief of something other than a factual kind. For analogous reasons, it is true that what we can recommend as useful cannot be something that is being recommended thereby as a proper object of belief. It may, of course, be very useful, for us or for others, if we believe certain statements to be true, but their being useful could not ever be a reason for holding them to be true. I don't want to labor this logical point, but I do want to emphasize that philosophers who have chided theologians, as I have just done, for logical or conceptual error in linking the notions of belief to those of choice and utility, may be right on the conceptual point, and yet have themselves failed to diagnose exactly what was being done by the theologians. For what they may have been noting is not, as I've hitherto presented it, an error about the familiar concept of belief, but a correct insight about a transformed concept. If we don't note this possibility, we shall be in no position to understand how the debate between theism and atheism has become culturally marginal. For I'm now in a position to answer, albeit crudely and schematically, one of the questions which I posed near the outset of my argument, namely, whether the cultural irrelevance, the marginal character of the debate between theism and atheism, was merely a product of the fact that the growing points of the key secular disciplines no longer happened, as it were by chance, to be in areas in which a confrontation with theism occurred obviously, directly, and inevitably. And the answer is that we've now got evidence that there is far more to it than this. It's not simply a matter of the directions in which secular knowledge has advanced, but of the directions in which theism has retreated, a direction that can be characterized by saying that theists have offered atheists less and less in which to disbelieve. And in so doing, theism has deprived active atheism of part of its point too, and of a great deal of its power, and has encouraged the more passive atheism of the indifferent. Thus, the internal development of theism in response to the challenge of secular epistemological standards has been a main factor in making the theism versus atheism dispute culturally marginal. But that the dispute between theists and atheists is relatively irrelevant and culturally marginal is not itself either an irrelevant or a marginal fact about the nature of contemporary culture. For with the absence of religious issues from the scene, we are distanced not just from a Sidgwick or a Leslie Stephen or even an Arnold, but also from a George Eliot or a Tolstoy. The attempt to restate theism so that its truth or otherwise is a living issue is therefore worth some trouble, and it's worth serious trouble to assess such attempts. I refer particularly to the attempts made by theologians as various as Bultmann, Bonhoeffer, Robinson in Europe, Tillich, Hamilton, Van Buren in this country, to restate certain essentials in Christian theology. And I want to view these attempts as a search for a response to the crisis of theism, which will avoid the well-defined responses of either rejection of the Christian religion or retreat into a self-enclosed set of formulations which we must simply and arbitrarily choose for or against, or in turn an attack upon contemporary secular culture in favor of self-conscious archaism. Neither Bertrand Russell, nor Karl Barth, nor T.S. Eliot, but what? Common to these theologians, different as they are, is the project of distinguishing a kernel in Christian theism which can and must be detached from an outmoded husk. They may not agree among themselves as to the criteria for distinguishing kernel from husk, but they do agree in ostensibly accepting the substance of a modern secular standpoint in order to argue its compatibility with their faith. For Van Buren, modern linguistic and analytical philosophy is perhaps the key element in that standpoint. For Hamilton, and earlier for Bonhoeffer, it is the erosion of an older sense of creaturely dependency as the result of scientific and technological achievement, and for others again, other elements are important. But all require of their own restatement of Christian theism that it shall both distinguish the theistic kernel from the theistic husk, and be intelligible and acceptable to contemporary educated, secularly minded men. What I want finally to argue is that these criteria are essentially incompatible with each other, that any presentation of theism which is able to secure a hearing from a secular audience will thereby have had to undergo a transformation which will have evacuated it entirely of its theistic content, and that any presentation which retains such a content will thereby be unable to secure the place in contemporary culture which these theologians desire for it. I am thus advancing not merely the weaker contention that all their attempts so far have in fact failed, but the stronger contention that any attempt of this kind must fail. Consider a number of examples of different kinds. Bultmann's revision of the Christian doctrine of salvation consists in identifying the Christian choice between redemption and damnation with the Heideggerian choice between authentic and inauthentic existence. Bultmann's pupil Kammler has in turn argued that if this identification is correct, then Jesus Christ is important only because he happened to anticipate Heidegger in uttering a true doctrine, the truth of which and our grounds for believing in the truth of which are quite independent of the truth of Christian orthodoxy. But if this is so, then the historical Jesus must lack the importance which Orthodox Christianity ascribed to him. I shall waive the question of whether Heideggerian interpretations of Christianity are likely to be any more intelligible to us than traditional ones, and simply say that Kammler is so obviously right on this point that he raises for us in the sharpest way the question of why Bultmann is able to think of himself as a Christian at all. And the answer is that Bultmann tacks on to his doctrine an entirely traditional and unexplained belief in the existence and nature of God. The link between the modernized formulations embodied in his demythologizing of the New Testament and the traditional theism is unstated and indeed must be arbitrary. Thus we can see that in Bultmann's case the theology falls into two compartments. That which is made credible ceases to be theistic, and that which remains theistic is offered without us being given any reason for believing in it. In the case of Tillich, we find perhaps not so much a simple division of the work into compartments as with Bultmann, but an oscillation. Tillich is prepared to use traditional theistic language, such as that which involves characterizing God as the ground of being, and to utilize an existentialist metaphysics at this point to provide a framework for this vocabulary. But when Tillich comes to explain his concept of God to the lay mind, he identifies God with man's ultimate concern. his freedom to pass from the metaphysical concept to the psychological, and transitions between the metaphysical and the psychological are at the very core of Tillich's thought, is partly at least secured by his insistence on characterizing the metaphysical entity in what turn out to be almost purely negative terms. And this leaves the positive characterization of God a matter of the psychological reduction involved in identifying God as a name for human concerns. But the psychological reduction is exactly what in the 19th century was called atheism by Feuerbach, who held the view that theistic language is not without a referent, albeit a purely human one. But for Feuerbach this entailed that theistic language was systematically inappropriate, that to decipher its true meaning entailed abandoning it, whereas Tillich, whose decipherment is remarkably similar to Feuerbach, sees no reason for acting as Feuerbach did. Whence this change? Precisely, I believe, because of the whole change in the cultural climate, in the character of theism, and in the relation of the two, which I described earlier. The theism in which Feuerbach disbelieved has undergone a sea change into the quite different theism which Tillich believed. That is, Tillich and Bultmann are not only to be explained in terms of those historical changes, but their writings provide further evidence that such changes have occurred. To turn to a quite different part of the theological spectrum for one additional piece of evidence, consider Van Buren's doctrine. Van Buren represents the extreme point in the sacrifice of theistic content. He wishes to preserve Christian language and practice without any commitment to anything that would traditionally have been recognized as belief in the existence of God. Prayer, for example, although making use of expressions which it would be natural to construe as addressed to an external deity to whom praise, petition, and thanksgiving might be appropriate, becomes instead a technique for orienting and transforming the self. But what Van Buren fails to recognize is that in that case prayer must be judged as just such a technique, competing with other such techniques, and notably with psychoanalysis. And we have little reason to believe that it would compete successfully. Or rather, in order that it should so compete, its practitioners would have to so learn from the experience which analytic therapies have provided that it would become transformed into something in which the gap between the theistic formulas recited and the non-theistic practices of which they were a part would become at best a grave embarrassment and probably would have to be discarded. That is, prayer would have been absorbed successfully into the family of secular analytic therapies, and one might indeed say that in Jungian theory and practice something rather like this has already happened. Thus, the abandonment of theistic content in favor of secular intelligibility leads away from any remnant of theistic practice. The essence of what I have to say about these new theologies is then that these theologies turn out to be symptoms of the very disease of which they profess to be the cure. But how does this concern those of us who are not theists? It does so in part because of a feature of the Victorian debate about God, of which I have so far taken little account. In the 19th century, theists as different as Gladstone and Dostoevsky were haunted by the fear that the loss of theistic belief would issue in moral collapse. Our contemporary theologians, with their quite new style, still express a concern that especially that part of the kernel of Christian belief and attitudes which is concerned with morality shall be released from the husk of outworn dogma, presumably because they too fear, as their theological ancestors did, that an entirely secularized world might lose a distinctive moral contribution contained in Christian theism. But for their theological ancestors, Christian theism had a distinctive and hostile relationship to certain elements in secular culture. And the whole point of atheism in the 19th century debate was that it spoke in the name of rejecting theism in this conflict, recognizing the context of conflict. The argument of this lecture has been that both the direction of secular culture and the direction of the development of theism have removed the conflict and so removed the point of the 19th century atheist contentions. That is, that the development of Christian theology has in a way made a good deal of atheist protest functionless. Yet, if it's true, as both old and new theologians contend, that there's a distinctive Christian morality, a distinctive Christian contribution to social and private practice, It would follow that at this level, at least, the conflict ought to recur. Does it? Although raising this topic indicates an additional importance in the themes which I've discussed in this lecture, obviously it requires a more extended treatment, and to it, therefore, I shall turn in my second lecture. In my first lecture, I argued that the debate between theism and atheism had become irrelevant to us today in a way that it was not to the Victorians for at least two reasons. The first was that for them, the issue of belief or unbelief was raised by just those intellectual disciplines which represented the growing parts of the culture: Darwinian biology, post-Hegelian philosophy, historical criticism. And the second was that theism had then a substantial content of which it has largely been evacuated as a result of the successive strategies and maneuvers adopted by theologians in the face of intellectual critique. And I might summarize what I had to say then about the character and significance of contemporary atheism by remarking that the attenuation of theism has left atheists with less and less point and purpose just because it has provided less and less in which to disbelieve. But it's also true that the atheist has failed to provide positive alternatives of his own. I turn now in this lecture to the question of how it stands not just in the intellectual debate between theism and atheism, but also in the moral debate. Almost all the great skeptics and atheists of the modern Western world have been moral conservatives, and often intensely so, in their lives as well as in their teachings. The moral behavior and attitudes of many Marxists and Freudians would have been highly distasteful to the Freud who disapproved of his fiancée learning to skate because she would have had to lean on the arm of another man, and the Marx who took so many of the traditional virtues of the family for granted. At the same time, Christian theists have played their part in the great crimes of the age. Devout Catholics were among the guards of the concentration camps, and believing Protestants participated in the bombings of Hiroshima and Dresden. In this situation, the Dostoevskian contention that if God does not exist, everything is permitted, must necessarily appear difficult to maintain. But it may be retorted the Dostoevskian contention applies only in the long run. The argument will go as follows. Lacking a belief in God, men lack an essential justification for morality, a justification the possession of which, although not sufficient to ensure moral behavior, is necessary to ensure it. And this necessity will appear not in the first or second generations, with a Freud whose father brought him up on the Bible, or a Marx who was the grandson of a rabbi, or a James Mill who began as a minister of the Church of Scotland. But their children's children, and the number of generations need not be made precise, will be bound to exhibit a decline in the moral standards which they adopt and in the behavior which they practice. As one influential image among religious apologists has it, the moral capital built up through centuries of theistic belief and practice will be slowly dissipated in the course of the development of secular life. What I want to do in this lecture is in part to uncover the inappropriateness of this image, and the step in the underlying argument upon which I first wish to fasten attention is that which holds that belief in God furnishes an essential justification for morality. I shall avoid in the main discussing whether theism, by the promise of rewards or the threat of punishments in a future life, does as a matter of fact furnish an effective motive for moral behavior. What I shall be principally concerned with are the logical connections between belief in God and morality, and I shall argue that theism itself requires and presupposes a moral vocabulary that can be understood independently of theistic beliefs and moral practices that can be justified independently. I take it to be characteristic of theism, as contrasted with pre-theistic religion, that God no longer has an exclusively local habitation. Particular places in the earth may in some special sense be dwelling places of the divine, whether the elements of the sacrament or the Holy of Holies in the temple, but God has become the God of all the earth. And as such, the way of life which God wills is distinguishable from that embodied in the social system of any particular community. That is, theism must raise the question of the right rules for man as such, of the true goods which men ought to pursue. And theism will thus need the critical use of an evaluative vocabulary, and all the more because the divine will has not only to be appealed to in the criticism of humanity, but has to be commended to humanity as well. This evaluative vocabulary will be employed in the formulation of central theological statements, when goodness is ascribed to God and obedience to him declared to be a virtue. But if such statements are to have any substantial content, the expressions such as good, virtue, and the like must be defined in terms the use of which does not presuppose theistic beliefs. To put it very crudely, if we are consistent and coherent theists, we ought to do what God commands because it is right in some independent sense of right, rather than holding that what God commands is right just because God commands it, a view which depends upon right being defined as being in accordance with what God commands. Now, to this it may be retorted that I am arguing that the former of these two views is logically required by the character of theism, and the latter excluded. But this cannot be so just because many theists think otherwise. For there is a well-known theological view, according to which the use of evaluative terms within theism must be idiosyncratic, and the meaning of these terms must be defined with reference to the will of God. When we call God good, we cannot on this view mean what we mean when we call men good. The standards embodied in the vocabulary of our ordinary evaluative discourse are, after all, the standards of a fallen, sinful race. This is the explicit or implicit position of many Protestants. Both Luther and Kierkegaard seem committed to it in at least some of their central writings, and it has its roots, perhaps, in the theological ethics of medieval nominalism. What I wish to show is that this fairly widespread view is internally incoherent, and the most vivid way in which I can begin to show this is by pointing out that it's difficult, if this view is correct, for theists to distinguish between God and the devil in the way that one supposes they must. For if God is good, and we ought to do whatever God commands, are transformed into tautologies by means of redefinitions of good and ought, it follows that we can have no moral reasons for obedience to divine commandments. All apparently reason-backed injunctions of the form, do this because God commands it, and what God commands is right, and obedience to his commands will produce certain goods, all these collapse into injunctions in which do this because God commands it is merely being reiterated in certain disguised and misleading ways. But if we cannot furnish this kind of reason for obedience to divine commandments, what other type of reason can there be but the appeal to divine power and to the consequences of flouting it? It's at this point that the differences between God and the devil are blurred. For God has been transformed by the proponents of this view into an Hobbesian sovereign, whose title to legitimate authority rests not on his absolute paternal care, his goodness as a father, but solely on his power. And the devil's lack of such a title rests solely on his inferiority in respect of power, and not at all on his inferiority in respect of virtue. Satan is an Hobbesian rebel who fails only to be a Hobbesian sovereign because he's unsuccessful, a truth that Milton half perceived, and half perceived, one believes, intentionally. Christian theism in particular can scarcely tolerate this. To cite only one example, the story of the temptation of Jesus by Satan with the offer of all the kingdoms of the world loses its point even as a parable, unless God and Satan stand in a radically different moral relationship to power in a sense of moral which is one ordinary familiar sense. It follows from this that theism, if it is to be coherent, must rely for its statement upon an independently understood moral vocabulary. To this conclusion, I now wish to add another and stronger thesis, namely that theistic practice depends upon the existence of independent moral practice. I can bring out what I mean by an analogy with the status of a legal code. One may have two quite different types of reason for obeying a given law. For example, the law that prohibits theft. One type of reason is that which appeals to the point or purpose of the prohibition, independently of the law, in this case to the advantages to be gained by each and all from the institution of stable property. The other type of reason is that which appeals to the prescribed penalties for disobedience to the law. A legal code which ordains and prohibits actions that are, so far as we are concerned, without point or purpose, commands our allegiance only insofar as it is able to deploy arbitrary power to enforce its sanctions. And it follows that we must have criteria by means of which we judge actions to have point and purpose, independently of and antecedently to the legal code. But as with legal codes in general, so also with the divine law. If God's commands are not to be mere fiats backed by arbitrary power, then they must command actions which can be seen to have point and purpose independently of and antecedently to the divine law. It follows that the practice of making evaluative and indeed moral judgments of action must be such that it could pre-exist the theistic injunctions to a particular way of life. The conceptual points which I am making here were clearly well understood in a great deal of medieval theology, and more especially by Aquinas. But they can be divorced from any specific commitment to Aristotelianism. What they cannot be divorced from is the requirement that morality should be understood in a particular way, be seen in one particular light. That is, theism requires not only an independent moral vocabulary and set of practices, but also that these should be of a certain kind. This requirement may not be noticed, because what theism requires morality to be is in fact what morality usually has been for long stretches of the past, although it will be a key contention of my later argument to hold that morality is of this kind no longer. What morality is required to be by theism, and what it usually has been, is a set of rules which are taken as given and as having authority independently of any views or decisions of individual agents. It is of the essence of morality on this view that we cannot decide or choose to treat a rule as a moral rule, or decide or choose to revise the rules on our own initiative, although we may discover that we were mistaken as to what the content of the rules in fact is. Theories about morality, when morality is considered in this light, are accounts of why the code of moral rules includes the items that it does and no others. Platonism and Aristotelianism are both theories of this kind, and Aristotelianism in particular grounds its explanation in a view of human nature as being so constituted that certain goals, needs, and wants are built into it. This theoretical explanation has the cogency that it has because the social life in which the given moral rules were operative embodied social agreement upon a certain way of life, and implicitly embodied just those goals, wants, and needs. It's clear, therefore, that when I speak of a morality in which moral rules are taken as given, I don't necessarily imply that this morality may not coexist with alternative justifying and explanatory theories. And I don't even imply that those who live by such a morality may be unaware of the possibility or the existence of alternative moral codes and practices. But I am committed to holding that morality of this kind is such that three convictions underpin it. First, that the correctness of our ordinary beliefs about the content of morality is at least as warranted, and probably better warranted, than our belief in any particular theory about morality. Secondly, that although our actual morality may be discrepant from the one true morality, this discrepancy is only marginal. And thirdly, that therefore, any theory of morality which suggests that our current moral beliefs are fundamentally mistaken is thereby discredited. This attitude to morality is compatible with quite different moral beliefs and has prevailed in quite different social contexts. Of itself, it doesn't entail any particular content for morality, but only a particular kind of allegiance to the current morality, whatever it is, and the endowing of it with a particular kind of authority. And as a matter of historical fact, I believe that this attitude outlived, in the medieval and modern Western worlds, a number of different contents for morality. This becomes particularly evident in its closing phases which are still with us but which began much earlier. Thinkers as radical as David Hume and J.S. Mill are noteworthy for their insistence, except on a few particular topics, Hume on suicide, for example, or Mill on birth control, that their utilitarianism, far from being at odds with current moral beliefs, provides both an explanation and an endorsement for them. The contrast between Bentham and J.S. Mill is instructive here. The whole emphasis in Bentham's use of the criterion of utility is laid upon the clash with established opinion. But in Mill's utilitarianism, Mill insists that rightly understood the very same criterion is consistent with, and indeed a support for, the larger part of what we have always believed. The relationship of theism to morality of this kind is uncomplicated. Theism furnishes an explanation of the authority and the givenness of the rules, both by according them the additional status of divine commandments and by providing grounds for the underlying belief in a single determinate human nature. God created men with just those goals, wants, and needs which a way of life embodying the given rules will enable them to achieve. To the natural morality of men, theism adds rules concerned with man's supernatural end and a set of beliefs and practices concerning guilt, repentance, and forgiveness to provide for moral as well as for religious failure. Theism and morality of this kind naturally and easily reinforce one another. It is, moreover, morality of this kind that I think theologians have in mind when they assert that the loss of theistic belief either will bring about or has brought about a loss of our grasp upon morality. It's therefore not an inopportune point in this lecture to state bluntly and crudely my central thesis, namely that such evidence as there is seems to me to point to the fact not that a loss of theistic belief produces a loss of moral belief and practice, but rather that a change in the character of morality is at least partly responsible for modern inability to accept theistic belief. That is, I wish to invert the Dostoevskian contention about the relationship between theism and morality. For I have argued that theism presupposed and needed for its own statement and practice a particular type of independent morality. I am now going to argue in support of my main thesis that this morality, or if you like, this traditional attitude to moral rules, which theism presupposed, has decayed for a number of reasons which are independent of and largely prior to our loss of theistic belief. I shall set out these reasons in a relatively unsystematic but roughly chronological order, because their historical interrelationship has yet to be adequately chronicled. The first is the impact of those versions of Christianity, mainly Protestant but also in some cases Catholic, according to which the corruption of human nature is such that human morality must be of no account. The consequence of this view is that from any human standpoint, the divine commandments do become arbitrary fiats imposed on us externally. Our nature does not summon us to obey them because we cannot recognize them as being for our good. The motives of hope of eternal reward and fear of eternal punishment are not now to reinforce but to replace our ordinary motives and aims. And at this point, two versions of the Protestant ethic appeared on the scene. The first is the one with which Weber familiarized us, according to which it is true at one and the same time that the realm of secular economic life is allowed to become autonomous in its norms, precisely because it is not the realm of salvation and damnation, and yet, at the same time, success in that realm is taken to be an outward sign of inward redemption. We are almost over-familiar with the process of secularization that has ensued in association with this ethic, but insufficiently familiar with the fact that as many texts from Luther at least could be cited in an account of an ethic of divine arbitrariness which coexisted with the first. Where Benjamin Franklin's autobiography is a classical text for the development of the Weberian ethic of work, James Hogg's novel, The Memoirs of a Justified Sinner, is the classical text for this kind of antinomianism. The hero, or perhaps we ought to say the protagonist, of Hogg's novel, has been taught to believe that the blood of Christ covers all his sins because he is of the elect. He concludes, therefore, that he may sin without limit, for the blood of Christ will cover whatever he does, and thus he envisages no restraint upon his actions and no reason for restraint other than that which would be imposed if he had to fear eternal damnation. His theism has left him moralityless, and it's notable that he can find in the social context no other reason for morality. Now clearly, Hogg portrays a character in whom a tendency present in real life has been carried to an extreme to which it is never or rarely carried in that life, just as Dostoevsky does with Raskolnikov. But the tendency is plainly one that undermines morality as hitherto understood. A second tendency, as or perhaps more inimical to that morality, was that embodied in the liberal principle that the individual is sovereign within the sphere of values. In classical liberalism, this principle is often and significantly expressed in an incoherent form. For it is first of all presented as itself an objective truth whose moral validity and authority in no way depends upon individual moral agents assenting to it or deciding to make it their own. And yet, since the right that it ostensibly confers upon the individual is an unrestricted right to make his own decisions as to what principles shall be binding upon him, it is a self-destructive principle. Certainly the picture derived from it of each individual as uttering moral injunctions to himself, which derive their authority from no source other than his own will and choice, is inconsistent with the morality that theism historically presupposes and requires. Kant's moral philosophy will provide us with illumination at this point, for Kant wrote at a key period for the history of the relations between theism and morality, when the rift between them had become clearly apparent, and morality had half, but only half, changed its character. It is an undergraduate essay commonplace that Kantian ethics is riddled with incoherence. The possibility that is treated with inadequate seriousness is that Kant was not in fact the incoherent and inconsistent analyst of a set of coherent and consistent moral concepts implicit in the practice and utterance of ordinary moral agents, but rather that Kant was the coherent and consistent recorder and analyst of an incoherent and inconsistent set of moral concepts, which were embodied in an incoherent and inconsistent moral practice, and one that had grown so as a consequence of the very tendencies which I have been noting. Kant, if we read him thus, provides us with confirmatory evidence on a number of points. The autonomy of morality he recognizes to the point of seeing that men cannot derive it from theism if they are to call God or the Holy One of Israel good in any significant sense. Yet he still invokes a theistic explanation to give morality point. He must do so, since Kant recognizes the heterogeneity, the variety, the incompatibilities which mark men's natural goals, needs, and wants, mean that these can provide us with no stable criteria. So Kant cannot find any point or purpose for morality in terms of the satisfaction of one determinate human nature created by God to be thus, as the medieval Aristotelians could. And theism has to be invoked in a quite different way in order that goodness may be rewarded in another life. At the same time as theism has only this attenuated function, the autonomous moral agent is presented as the authority who has to utter to himself a set of moral prescriptions which have no authority other than that which they derive from being uttered by him as a rational agent to himself, and yet have the character of a law. But what authority can a law have which I utter to myself? And what sanction can a law have of which I am expressly told that there are no earthly sanctions, and where the theistic sanction is expressly invoked to make morality theoretically intelligible rather than to provide men with a motive? In other words, in Kant's writings, the notion of morality as a law, and with it the traditional notion of a one true morality, is being combined with a liberal individualist recognition of the individual's sovereignty, and so was being considered as a law only in a rather curious and marginal sense. And this unstable combination was bound indeed to lead to a victory for the liberal individualist elements of the conceptual scheme, and a defeat for those elements derived from traditional ways of regarding morality. This is because these matters were not merely episodes in the intellectual history of philosophy and theology, but stand in intimate relationship to what was happening in society at large. For the morality that had become so incoherent in theory had its roots in a social practice of which the central feature was a rate and type of social change which made ordinary men far more conscious of the actual and potential variety of competing and conflicting moralities and ways of life, and of the continuous need to make choices between them, and so was inimical to the notion of a one true morality to be discovered. It's a commonplace of social history that the industrial working class in Western Europe were not lost to the churches at some point. They never entered them. And they never entered them in part because in the process of urbanization and industrialization, they were torn out of the type of community which provided a moral environment of the traditional kind which I have characterized, in which theism still made sense, and they were absorbed instead by a form of social life where religious utterance and activity necessarily became a series of contextless gestures. It is of course true that the moral education of those who developed in such an environment was never theistic, partly because the church was so often simply physically absent in industrial society. But my argument is that had the church been present, and where the church was in fact present, the moral beliefs necessary as a background for theism were lacking, and as lacking in non-intellectual milieus as in the intellectual. All these tendencies helped to foster a climate in which two beliefs came to be among the unexpressed assumptions of almost all moral debate. The first of these is that disagreements between rival moral views are essentially and in principle unsettlable, that there are no criteria shared by men as such to which appeal may be made to settle fundamental disputes, that disagreement is boundless. In the 20th century, this belief became articulated in philosophical theories as different as the emotivism of C.L. Stevenson and the existentialism of Sartre. But the moral practice and utterance of which Stevenson and Sartre were offering analyses was not moral practice and utterance as these had always been, or as they logically must be, but the moral practice and utterance of one particular culture which came into existence as belief died in a single determinate human nature for which a single moral code was appropriate. The obvious counterpart, therefore, to the belief that fundamental moral disputes are in principle unsettlable is the belief that there is not a single determinate human nature, but that human nature is immensely malleable, and that around the relatively unchanging biological center, society and culture may weave very different patterns, resulting in widely varying wants, needs, and goals. It's just because this belief is dominant that no ultimate shared criteria by which moral disputes may be resolved can be invoked. In this situation, where theism has lost the morality which it logically presupposed, the lack of social contact with contemporary belief and practice is partly to be explained by the lack of logical connection between theistic beliefs and modern moral beliefs. Hence, of course, once more, the tendencies which I remarked upon in the first lecture of theism either to retreat into a closed orthodoxy, or some doctrine of arbitrary choice, or cultural atavism. It's not only the intellectual climate created by science that has transformed theism into an alien cult, but also the moral climate. And in this moral climate, theism is confronted by dilemmas parallel to the intellectual ones which I outlined in the first lecture. It's perhaps not uncharacteristic of the two nationalities that American versions of the new theology have been dominantly concerned with intellectual issues, British versions perhaps rather more with moral ones. One of the great myths of British life is that American culture is somehow less intellectual than British. The reverse is actually the case. The new morality, which is not only a concomitant of the new theology in Britain, but since it represents the heart of the matter when more traditional versions of theism have been demythologized, a very substantial part of it, is usually presented in terms of problems of personal and sexual relationships rather than problems of politics or war. That this theistic morality should be least at home with those moral problems embedded in the very structure of our communal lives is itself damaging. But even more damaging is the content of what the new morality has to say upon the problems on which it does utter. Consider the two poles of the new morality, represented by John Robinson, the Bishop of Woolwich, and the British Council of Churches Commission's report on sexual morality. Robinson abandons the traditional forms of justification for Christian attitudes to sexuality, in fact, but he preserves the traditional rules. The British Council of Churches Commission abandons both. Robinson thereby retains something distinctive for the Christian view, but he makes it as unintelligible and convincing and arbitrary, indeed more unintelligible and unconvincing and arbitrary, than it was on the basis of purely conservative religious moralism. The Commission submerges anything distinctive in a theistic view in order to become acceptable to the contemporary secular mind, and the cost of this is that the distinctively Christian disappears in the process. One might indeed say of the Commission's report that it is either untrue or impertinent. Its belief, for example, that it is permissible to allow sexual relationships outside marriage in exceptional cases is untrue if traditional Christianity is true. But if traditional Christianity is false, then the Commission ought to admit that it is now announcing to the secular world as a discovery what the secular world has been announcing to it for rather a long time. Robinson, on the other hand, having officially abjured a legalistic morality of rules, in other words, the traditional concept of a moral law, and declared his allegiance to a morality in which the motive of love is what is required and is all that is required, still wants to declare that a man who acts from this motive will actually abstain from sexual relationships outside marriage. But this can only be the case if the traditional rules are covertly reintroduced by a special redefinition of words such as love. Only, since Robinson has rejected the traditional forms of justification for the traditional rules which he needs for his redefinitions, his adhesion to them necessarily appears arbitrary and irrational. This reproduction in the moral realm of a form of dilemma which was familiar in my argument in the first lecture as applied to the intellectual realm, could of course be presented simply as part of an attack upon theistic positions from a secularist and atheist standpoint. To do this, however, would be misguided and imprudent in a way which becomes clear if we turn from considering the gap between theism and the contemporary moral situation to that between the prophecies of the great 18th and 19th century secularizers and that same situation. The refutation of theistic belief was classically presented by these authors as a form of liberation for the human spirit. An irrational and superstitious worldview was to be replaced by a rational and progressive one. The strangling of the last king by the entrails of the last priest would celebrate a marriage between social forms in which men would determine their own destiny and beliefs by means of which they would understand their place in the world rationally. If the moral rhetoric of theism has become disembodied, the moral rhetoric of this kind of secularism has scarcely achieved incarnation at all, and in each case for not dissimilar reasons. The majority of secular moralities are versions of utilitarianism, and all versions of utilitarianism suffer from what has happened to the key term utility and to those cognate terms such as happiness and even pleasure which have been employed as substitutes or elaborations of it. The expression utility in English is originally used both with a narrower meaning and in a far narrower set of contexts than it is employed in by the utilitarians. Its use in expressing a general criterion by which rival claims upon an individual and rival claims by different individuals may be weighed against one another presupposes the prior identification of a homogeneous set of goals, needs, and wants with respect to which preferences can be ordered in a generally acceptable way. But in fact, as I've already pointed out in another context, except within very limited areas of modern life, such an identification cannot take place. Our range of disagreements over what principles to profess and what actions to perform is not merely matched by, but is the natural outcome of the wide diversity of goals, wants, and needs which marks contemporary human nature. The good for man can't be defined in terms of agreement in wanting, even in long-term wanting, because our wants are so various and also so variable and mutable. This inability to frame general moral notions and general criteria has all the graver consequences because it occurs in an age when moral particularity is all the time being left behind. Indeed, the need for general notions and criteria springs from that fact. By the loss of moral particularity, I refer to the way in which those concepts of virtue which were tied to particular occupations and statuses have been submerged in general notions. Expressions such as duty and obligation will illustrate the point. These notions originally have a highly specific force. Duties are the duties which belong to a particular office or status. Obligations, the particular obligations which arise out of either status or contractual relationships. What duties a man has is a question of fact, the fact about the offices which he holds. What obligations a man is under is equally a question of the facts about his status and the contracts which he has entered into. The processes by which duty in the singular with a capital D replaces duties in the plural with a small d, and obligation similarly replaces obligations, is one in which simultaneously these notions are evacuated of any particular reference to the facts of social life, and generalized into near synonyms for what one ought to do, not as a holder of this or that particular office or status, but as a man who happens to be in particular circumstances. This process of generalization of the moral vocabulary is, of course, part of the rise of an individualism which wants to separate what a man is from what it sees as the mere contingencies of kinship, status, and occupation. It's thus not a factor independent of some of the other elements which I have noticed as agencies in the corrosion of traditional morality. But in noting it, we also have to note something new, which is the consequent impoverishment of the moral vocabulary. Pleasure, utility, and happiness are concepts which could once have been plainly distinguished. Within a secular utilitarian framework, the differences all become blurred. Duty and obligation suffer similarly. The criteria for inclusion in the list of the virtues and the vices become unclear. And it's worth inquiring whether this is not a symptom of something even more fundamental. The point of the inquiry, it will be recalled, was to assess the attempt of recent theologians to uncover a distinctive moral content in Christianity by a revision of dogma. But my suggestion was that any theism which retained enough content to be theism presupposed an independent morality of a certain traditional kind. This morality, I argued in turn, was a central feature of a culture that has been partly, and in some areas of social life largely, transformed out of existence. Theism has therefore lost the one morality with which it can integrate itself and which it can illuminate. But this, I have now been suggesting, has been the result of a process which is equally disconcerting to any would-be successor of the prophets of atheism and secularism, from the French philosophe through Marx to Freud. This process has been the result of a number of factors which I've listed in an unsystematic way, and this lack of system was unavoidable. Systematization would involve a kind of sociological theory of culture and of religion's place in it, which we're only beginning to formulate, and an historical narrative which has yet to be written. But we can ask if we can summarize more clearly what these changes have amounted to, what shape we can perceive the end product to be of a process which is admittedly incompletely realized, and realized to a very different extent in different areas of our life. I've been working hitherto in a fairly uncritical way with the category of the moral, as though it were a clearly defined category to be set alongside the categories of the aesthetic, the political, the religious, and so on, in such a way that a given item would fall into one or other category clearly. Such a categorization is clearly implicit in my discussion of the relations between theism and morality. But there are, of course, societies in the past to which the attempt to apply this range of categories would be misleading. In the Icelandic society portrayed in the sagas, the moral structure of the society and the social structure are not two things, but one, a fact vividly exemplified in the fact that skulder, the ancestor of our word should, is used to express the ideas both of being a kinsman of someone and of being under an obligation to someone. But it's not, of course, the case that skulder is systematically ambiguous, that it's a word designed for making puns. The two ideas are fused into one within the Icelandic conceptual scheme. And so great is the particularity of this morality that it can provide no moral resources for the critique of that social structure of which it is itself a part. The same was perhaps true of the Greek moral vocabulary at a certain stage. But can we then, without being misleading, go on talking of it as a morality? Only if we are careful not to imply that the moral has to be an autonomous category here, as it is in some other societies. For there are, of course, societies to which this kind of categorization does have application, where morality is an autonomous or semi-autonomous realm. And such must, if my earlier argument is correct, be societies where theism flourishes and societies which still live in the shadow of theism. But if the latter part of my argument is correct, our own post-theistic society is one in which, in the ballet of the categories, to use Hegel's vivid metaphor, morality has collapsed into, and the dance is, as Hegel pointed out, a drunken one, its neighbours. What is this collapse, and what has taken morality's place? It does not perhaps matter much at this point whether we speak of morality changing its character or of it being replaced. The latter formulation may, however, invite us to ignore the extent to which the categories to which morality has become assimilated are themselves transformed by this assimilation. Two categories at least are important to notice. The first is that of the organizational. When histories of morality are written, they do not usually refer to the topics included in works by sociologists about organization theory. Equally, organization theorists do not usually refer us back to the history of morals. But as more and more of life is bureaucratized, and as even informal organizations and informal procedures within formal organizations are affected by their bureaucratic context, more and more of the decisions which once belonged to milieus of social life outside the sphere of organization come within it. Lipset has remarked, in relation to politics, how bureaucratization removes more and more decisions from the realm of ends to that of means, converts areas of moral disagreement into areas of technical disagreement. But what Lipset does not remark when he says this is that this does not leave the area of technical disagreement what it was before. For it seems to be true that men identify themselves the more with one side or the other in issues of procedure and technique. And if this is so, commitment acquires quite a new style, and the organizational milieu a different type of moral importance. I'm not here accepting the banal thesis of White's organization man, indeed almost the opposite. The work of Argyris, for example, shows the tension between the need for suppression of the emotions which the rational procedures of an organization generally require, and the need to develop the virtues of personal sensitivity if common participation in the organization is to be effective. That is, Argyris's work in effect shows that effective organizations are forced to breed virtues which they cannot entirely accommodate, and which provide their members with a moral standing ground that is at once to some degree independent of the organization's immediate needs, as these are seen by those who control it, and yet inseparable from the organizational milieu. That is, we have here neither the complete identification of moral and social structure, which is found in some relatively simple societies, nor that stark distinctiveness so characteristic of an earlier phase of our own society, but a far more complex interrelationship. And it's not surprising that the morality of organizations should have been misperceived as mere mass conformism from the standpoint of an older morality. For here we have not only a new content, but also a quite new style. The word style significantly brings us to a second category with which morality has blended, that of the aesthetic. Not what you say or write, but how you say it, how you look as you say it, and in what typeface you present it, what badges you exhibit for recognition by others, the purity or impurity of response to those badges. All these infect the substance of contemporary urbanized relationships in a way that means that what is at stake for the individual and what failure or success in these matters may cost him is a sign that the aesthetic has acquired a new moral dimension, the moral being aestheticized. And all this, of course, creates a climate in which it's difficult to raise the traditional questions to which theism gave answers, because the morality which both questions and answers presupposed is lacking to so great a degree, and to that same degree questions and answers have equally become unintelligible. What does this entail, first for the new theologian and then for the atheist? The new theologian is, I think, faced, as I agreed in my first lecture, with the disconcerting fact that the demythologizing of his gospel, the proclamation that the absence or death of God, or at least of the idea of God, leaves him without moral any more than intellectual distinctiveness, that all this has to be faced. Just as Bultmann has been shown by Kamler to be nothing but a Heideggerian of a secular kind in substance, but not perhaps in vocabulary, just as Tillich, by defining God in terms of ultimate human concern, made of God no more than an interest of human nature, so the new morality evaporates also into either what is arbitrary and incredible, or else what is familiar secular doctrine endowed with a religious vocabulary in which the meaning of the key terms has been changed. The new theology, in other words, in morals as well as intellectually, turns out to be the project of retaining a religious vocabulary emptied of its belief content. But before the atheist scorns this overmuch, he ought to ask what light this throws on his own predicament. For the need for a religious vocabulary and the response to the new theology testifies to this need must partly spring from the failure of atheists of many different kinds to provide any other vocabulary in which the traditional religious and moral questions could be asked and answered. Indeed, the tendencies for these ideologies, which to a limited degree have provided a contemporary secular vocabulary for such questions, to relapse into religious forms, I refer to psychoanalysis particularly, but also to Marxism, is commonplace. And the tendencies which I have tried to identify in our culture are ones which are inimical to the raising of general questions, and therefore ones which place not only theism, but also its atheistic critics in a position where their debates cannot answer to contemporary cultural needs, and yet there is a desperate need to articulate general questions. And we ought to recognize the centrality of these facts in any cultural analysis. The form of these lectures demands that at this point in the argument I should raise a question which is doubtless often asked by those who attend lectures, but normally, I imagine, considered redundant by lecturers. This is the question, is after all what I have been saying really true? My total argument involves points drawn from a number of academic disciplines, and this is itself a reflection of the cultural situation about which I've been talking. The present lines between our disciplines were no doubt drawn for a number of different kinds of reason, but one is that distinct subject matters have existed in the past, which in the present have fused or partly fused. So in one sense I have dealt with a single subject matter, a single historical thread, the tracing of which I think shows more specifically what I suggested at the outset, that the image of theism as having accumulated a moral capital which secularism will dissipate is entirely inappropriate to the complex relationships and interdependencies of theism, morality, and atheism, and more generally, that the marginal character of the debate about God in our culture is a matter of great moment to that culture. But to trace that single thread, I have had to make points, each of which require vindication in disciplines as various as philosophy, history, literature, the sociological theory of organization, and so on. I therefore can't but regard my argument as provisional, as relying on a set of analyses and hypotheses which all deserve much closer scrutiny. Yet there is perhaps some virtue in having tried to paint on a larger canvas, for to do this is to exhibit the point of pursuing some particular analyses rather than others, and examining the evidence for some particular hypotheses rather than others. And indeed, there is no other way of exhibiting this. These lectures, then, mark the beginning of an investigation rather than its ending. My assertions have been framed with an eye to suggesting questions rather than merely giving answers. But on one point, at least, I hope it's clear that the conclusion of these lectures is more than provisional. This is that the atheist and the theist share a common dilemma in trying to raise, in a cultural and social setting which is inimical to both parties, a type of question on the importance of which they agree, however much they may dispute about the answers. And in what they say they are bound themselves, however much they resist it, to discover within them the very inimical tendencies. When in the last century Robertson Smith was convicted of heresy by his Scottish Presbyterian ministerial peers because he insisted on investigating the Old Testament from what we should now see as an anthropological standpoint, what worried his colleagues was not perhaps so much the particular points which they made explicit, as something that they themselves did not and could not make wholly explicit, the tendency to see religious beliefs in a social context and to ask about them not directly are they true, but why should men in that sort of society hold that sort of belief? We experience little discomfort when we view the beliefs of the Nuer or the Azandi in this way, for nothing is at stake for us in the truth or otherwise of their beliefs. But when we focus on our own beliefs, we find it difficult to go on asking both questions, both the question about truth and the question about why in our society we should believe one way rather than another. I may seem indeed in these lectures to have been trying vainly to view the debates between atheists and theists as if I were an anthropologist from another culture, and would indeed that we were able to adopt such a standpoint, because then we might acquire the kind of objective self-knowledge which would enable us to distinguish between temporary cultural fashion and long-term cultural trends, a distinction that anyone who writes or speaks on these topics must always fear that he hasn't taken account of sufficiently. But it is at least perhaps clear from my argument that in underlining the changed place of the debate between theism and atheism in our culture, we go some way to setting out the preliminaries for a better understanding both of that culture and of ourselves.